everyone had an opinion on this issue, and everyone thought they were right on this issue. And the reality was that everyone was right and everyone was wrong. Does this sound familiar at all to you? It's almost like Paul could have written now concerning the 2020 election, or now concerning whether or not you should wear masks. All of us have an opinion, and all of us think we're right. And the reality is that all of us are right and all of us are wrong. The people around you who disagree with you, they are not accountable to you. It is not your responsibility to change their mind. It is not your responsibility to bring them into conformity with your beliefs and your opinions. They are the servant of another. Who are they a servant of? The servant of God. Love is others focused. I can't honor Jesus if I'm always focused on myself, if I always have to be right, if I have to win every argument. I can't honor Jesus. And love is a choice. And so I can't honor Jesus if I'm not willing to bear the burdens of others and endure the burdens of others. And I can't honor Jesus if I'm not willing to assume the best about people and hope for the best for people. And love is lasting. So I can't honor Jesus if I give up on people. See, my opinion is less important than my love. That means that sharing my opinion and fighting for my opinion is less important than sharing love and fighting for love. Good morning. Welcome to the gathering. Welcome to those of you who are online watching us. Glad you can be with us in spirit. We certainly do all have opinions, don't we? And sometimes those opinions can threaten to tear us apart. It feels a little bit right now like we're living in a time when there are two different opinions and everybody has one of them. And if you don't believe my opinion, well, then you're a terrible person. Or if I don't believe your opinion, then I'm a terrible person. And sometimes this fight between the two opinions leads to relational conflict. It destroys friendships. It destroys families. Have you been feeling this lately? It all centers around one really significant question with two options. The question is, of course, what is the best kind of breakfast? Is it biscuits and gravy, or is it pancakes? Let's take a quick vote. Biscuits and gravy? Yes. All right, we have some biscuits and gravy. Pancakes? All right, I think pancakes takes it in this service. In the last service, it was about split. But different people have different opinions, right? Some like biscuits and gravy, and some like pancakes. This isn't really what we're going to talk about this morning, but I just wanted to put this up here to let you know that this Saturday at 8 o'clock, we're having a men's breakfast out at the barn. And for this one, it will be biscuits and gravy. For the last one, it was pancakes, and I imagine the next one, it will be pancakes. For this one, it's biscuits and gravy, but there will be eggs and coffee, and I'm sure they'll have other things as well. But 8 o'clock, out at the barn. So if you're a man and you like breakfast, show up. It'll be a great time to just get to know some people, maybe reconnect with people you haven't seen in a while. And in fact, if you're a man and you don't like breakfast, you can still come. If you're a man and you just like coffee, there will be coffee. If you're a man and you don't like coffee, you need to talk to me. Okay? No, I'm just kidding. But so that's this Saturday, 8 o'clock out at the barn. Should be done between 9 and 9:30. Now, there really is a question that we need to answer this morning, isn't there? We've been working through this series about politics and the election and what does it look like to be a Christian in America in 2020. And our journey takes us to a question today that maybe is the biggest question we need to answer in this series. And the question is, would Jesus have voted for donkeys or elephants, right? So was Jesus a Republican or was Jesus a Democrat? Now, the easy answer to that is, of course, well, things were different then. This was 2,000 years ago. There weren't any Republicans and there weren't any Democrats. Jesus lived in a different time, in a different place. He lived in the Middle East. He lived under Roman rule. It was very different, and so maybe this question isn't relevant. But maybe it is, because Jesus certainly did live at a different time, and he lived in a different place, and the Romans ruled the world at that time. But in Judea, where Jesus lived, they were ruled by a group called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a ruling council made up of two different parties. And the people in these two parties hated each other. We know them as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, normally when we hear the Pharisees and the Sadducees, we think, oh, these were two groups that were united against Jesus, right? The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they all hated Jesus. But the reality is, the only thing that united the Pharisees and the Sadducees was their hatred of Jesus. That was the only thing that brought them together. In fact, on every other issue, they were polar opposites. Now, this is starting to sound a little familiar, right? So the Pharisees, they were kind of the party of traditional values. They respected the history of Israel and the law of Moses. In fact, they loved the law of Moses so much that they added on to it, and they would go after anyone who didn't follow the law of Moses. The Pharisees, or the Sadducees, on the other hand, they were kind of like, yeah, you know, the past is the past. Let's live in the future. Let's be more progressive. Let's put the law behind us and just see what happens here. The Pharisees were very anti-Rome. So they were anti-big government. They were much more in favor of less government and local government, whereas the Sadducees, they were big government. They were on the side of Rome. In fact, they were connected with Rome and united with Rome. They were actually the ruling party at the time because they were partnered with Rome. The Pharisees were the law and order party. They said, hey, everybody needs to live by the law. Everybody needs to obey the law. They were willing to stone people who didn't follow the law. And the Sadducees were kind of the pragmatic party. You know, whatever works, let's just do that. Let's not worry so much about what the law says. And so you had these two parties, very different, but very similar to what we have today. And if you read through the Gospels, you see Jesus interacting over and over again with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Sometimes we lump them all together because we think of the religious leaders. But the reality is they would come to him separately. Sometimes the Pharisees would come to Jesus and they would ask him a question. And actually what they were trying to do was they were trying to get Jesus to answer the question in a way that would prove he was on their side. Because Jesus was growing in influence. More and more people were following him. And the Pharisees thought, if we can get Jesus to be on our side, then we get all of Jesus' followers on our side. And then the Sadducees would come with a question, and they would ask Jesus a question in hopes that he would answer their question in a way that would prove he was on their side so that they could get all of Jesus' followers. But we know that when Jesus answered their questions, he never took a side. And ultimately, that's why they killed him. You see, because at some point, the Pharisees and the Sadducees came together, and they said, look, this guy's not going to join either of our sides. But his following is growing so large that he'll soon be more powerful than both of us. So we need to get rid of him. You see, when given the opportunity to pick a side, Jesus didn't. Now, there were some issues that he agreed with the Pharisees on. And there were some issues that he agreed with the Sadducees on. But he refused to put anybody in one of those little boxes. Instead, he tried to unite people. In Matthew chapter 10, Matthew, who's writing the book, gives us a list of Jesus' followers, the 12 disciples. And in this list, it's very interesting that he names all 12 of the disciples. But with 2 of the disciples, he tells us what they did. One of them was himself. He refers to himself as Matthew, the tax collector. And the other one is a guy named Simon, who he refers to as Simon the Zealot. Now, a tax collector was someone who worked for the Roman Empire. Matthew got his living from collecting taxes for Rome. So Rome benefited from Matthew. Matthew benefited from Rome. We might say that Matthew was pro-Rome, which would have probably put him more on the Sadducee side. Now, a zealot was someone who was committed to the violent overthrow of the Roman Empire. So if you read in history about some of the Jewish uprisings and rebellions against Rome, almost always they were led by or connected to the zealots. The zealots were happy to give their lives to destroy Rome, to free Israel from Rome. So get this. Jesus brings these 12 guys together. And one of them is Matthew, who gets his living from Rome, who is connected to Rome, who supports Rome. And the other one is Simon, who is committed to the violent overthrow of Rome. And Jesus brings them together and says, hey guys, we are all on the same team. And if Jesus could bring these two guys who were polar opposites together and say, hey, we're all on the same team, then the challenge for us also is to do what? Say, maybe it shouldn't be about taking sides, but finding ways to come together. Here's what I want to do this morning. This morning, we're going to try to answer this question, how would Jesus have voted? How should Christians vote? What does it look like for us as Christians to be part of the political process in 2020? And what we're going to do is look at 3 passages. We'll start in the Gospels, looking at a teaching of Jesus from Matthew 22, because that's always a great place to start with what Jesus said. Then we'll go to Romans, and we'll see how Paul commented on Jesus' teaching. One of the things that Paul does really well is he interprets and applies the teachings of Jesus to our lives. And so we'll see what Paul had to say about this teaching of Jesus. And then finally, we'll go back to the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, we'll discover a timeless principle that I think will tie it all together for us. And so by the time we're done, it's my hope that what we have is a practical principle for political engagement. All right, that's our goal for today. And we're going to start in Matthew chapter 22. So in Matthew 22, Jesus is teaching as he always does, and he's approached by the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, remember, they want to get Jesus on their side. And so they have a question for him, and they start by kind of buttering him up. And Jesus, you're so wise, and we know you're going to have a great answer to our question. And in verse 17, they ask a question. They say, Jesus, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now remember, the Pharisees, they're anti-Rome, they're small government, which means they are the party that wants to do what? Cut taxes. They want Jesus to say, well, no, of course you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar. Taxes are immoral. But what they're really trying to do is box Jesus in. They're trying to make this an us versus them question. They want to force Jesus to either jump in their box with them, the box of no taxes, or they're saying, Jesus, if you're not going to jump in our box, then we're going to put you in the other box. We're either going to claim you or kill you, which feels a lot like politics today, right? We try to put each other into boxes, and we say to people, well, what do you believe? Which side are you on? Are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? Are you for Trump or are you against Trump? We put each other into these boxes so we can either claim each other or kill each other. But of course, Jesus, as he always does, has the perfect answer, and he begins by saying, hey, does anybody have a coin? Somebody pulls out a coin, and Jesus holds up and says, whose picture is on this coin? And the answer is, well, that's Caesar. Jesus says, yes, it is. And then he says, therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. See, that coin represents the benefits Caesar had given to the people. By creating a currency, which is what the coin is, it's a currency, Caesar or Rome had made it possible for people to trade. You could go anywhere in the known world at that time and trade with others because everyone was using the same currency, and that was because of Rome. You could sit down with your neighbor and make a deal and know that you weren't getting ripped off because you were both using the same currency, and that was because of Rome. Other benefits of being in the Roman Empire were roads going everywhere and safe travel ensured by the Roman army. And so what Jesus is actually saying here is, look, you're receiving benefits from Rome, and this coin is symbolic of that. Therefore, you should pay your taxes. Do you use Rome's currencies? Pay your taxes. Do you use Rome's roads? Pay your taxes. But subtly, Jesus is getting at something else here. He's just pointing out to us that even a corrupt and evil government, led by a corrupt and evil man, can still do good things for the people. Because Rome was certainly not a good empire, right? They were evil and they were wicked, and all of the Caesars were pretty bad guys. And yet there was still some benefit to being part of the Roman Empire. And Jesus said, look, if there's benefit to being part of the Roman Empire, then pay your dues, pay your taxes. Now, as an aside, this second statement by Jesus, we should pay close attention to. He says, oh, and also, pay to God the things that are God's, which is to say, if you receive any benefit from living in God's creation, then you need to give your life to Him. Jesus is telling the people, look, there's a principle here for living in a land that is ruled by a person. And it is this: if that person is doing what they're supposed to do and asking you to pay your taxes, then you should do it. Now, Paul picked up this principle. And in Romans 13, Paul kind of walked the Romans through this principle. He begins by saying in Romans 13:1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. What does it mean to be subject? It means to submit yourself, to obey. Basically, Paul is saying, look, if you have someone who rules over you, if you have someone who's been placed in authority over you, you need to obey them. Now, sometimes we get mixed up with, well, do I obey God or do I obey human authority? Remember, Peter, in the book of Acts, was called before the Sanhedrin along with the other apostles, and the Sanhedrin said, all right, guys, look, you need to stop talking about Jesus. We are commanding you no more talk about Jesus. And Peter stood up and said, God, we appreciate that, and we would like to obey you. However, we must obey God rather than man. So Peter's making it very clear there, and here Paul is not saying anything differently. He's saying, look, there's human authority and there's God's authority, and we're subject to both. But if they are in conflict with one another, that's when we obey God rather than man. We have to find a balance here. See, I have to be willing to submit myself to human authority because that's what God tells me to do. And as long as those in authority don't compel me to violate God's law, then I need to obey them. Why? Well, Paul goes on to explain why. He says, look, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Anyone who is in authority is there because God let them. God is never surprised by who's in authority. Now, contemplate just for a minute what this means for us as Christians. All right? Because what it means is that whatever you may think of Barack Obama or Donald Trump or maybe Joe Biden, they were put in place by God. They are or were or will be the servants of God. Now, they're not always good servants, right? Just like all of us, they fall short of God's righteousness, but they are placed there by God. Now understand, just because God puts someone in authority doesn't mean that is a good person. In fact, the whole story of the Bible is about God working through very flawed authority to bring about His will and His purpose. God allowed Pharaoh to have authority over the Israelites. That doesn't mean Pharaoh was a good person. God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to conquer Israel. That doesn't mean Nebuchadnezzar was a good person. God allowed Rome to build an empire that lasted for hundreds of years. That doesn't mean that Rome was a righteous empire. Just because God allows someone into authority doesn't mean that that person is a good person. However, what it does mean is that they are accountable to God, not to us. Well, what's the standard for leadership? Well, Paul keeps going, and he says this in verse 3. He says, look, rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. He's laying out a principle here that good leadership, human authority that pleases God, rewards good behavior, and punishes bad behavior. So look, if you're in a leadership position, this is it for you. Reward good behavior and punish bad behavior. This is God's expectation of anyone He puts into leadership. It goes right along with the principle of how we use our gifts. Right? All of us have been given gifts by God. Some of those gifts are talents and abilities. Sometimes our gifts are our passions or our past. Sometimes they're our possessions. Whatever it is that we have, everything we have is given by God. And his expectation is that we use what he has given us to further his kingdom. And in the same way, leadership is a gift. And his expectation is if he's given you leadership, you should use it to reward good and punish bad. By the way, if you're a parent, this is great parenting advice. In fact, this is the only parenting advice you need. If you reward your kids for good behavior and punish them for bad behavior, there's a pretty good chance they're going to turn out all right. Because this is God's model of leadership. Now, we want to live in a place. We want to live in a place where good behavior is incentivized and bad behavior is disincentivized, but it always doesn't work that way, does it? Because sometimes in human leadership, you have flawed humans leading, which means they don't always lead the way God tells them to lead. And we see that in our own country, we see that in our state, we see that in our cities, we see it everywhere. We see it in ourselves. We don't always do what God expects us to do. And yet, whether or not human authority fulfills their God-given responsibility doesn't change whether or not I fulfill my responsibility to God. And what is my responsibility? Well, let's keep going. Verse 7, Paul says this, "Pay to all what is owed. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed." He says, I don't owe those in authority because of what they've done, or because of who they are, or because of how great they are. That's not why I owe them my taxes, my respect, my honor. I owe them because God has placed them there. And Paul says, pay to all. He doesn't say I get to pick and choose who I want to respect. He doesn't say I get to pick and choose who I want to honor. I don't get to pick and choose to whom I pay my taxes. He says, if God has put them in place, this is my responsibility toward them. No matter who wins this election, some of you are going to be disappointed. And it's good for me to remind you, even if you're disappointed, even if your person doesn't win, it is very unchristian for us to say things like, well, that's not my president, or that's not my party, that's not my ruler. Because when we do that, not only are we being disrespectful to the person God has put in place, but we're calling into question whether or not God got it right. So the challenge for us is to be willing to say, well, wasn't my choice, but God must know what he's doing, and so I will pay to all what is owed, and I will give my respect, and I will give my honor, because God has put them there. God's people had to wrestle with this. In the Old Testament, the city of Jerusalem was attacked by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And the city of Jerusalem lost. The walls were torn down. The temple was burned. The people were captured and carried off to Babylon, where they were resettled as exiles, as captives. And as they begin to get familiar with their new acquaintance, the prophet Jeremiah wrote them a letter. We find this letter in Jeremiah chapter 29. I'm going to pick it up in verse 5. Jeremiah says this, "Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce." By the way, it takes time to build a house, right? And if you plant a garden, it takes time before you harvest it. Take wives and have sons and daughters. It usually takes at least 9 months between those two things to happen. Take wives for your sons. So now we're talking about a lot of time, aren't we? Because I just had my son, and now it says take a wife for him, so now my son is grown. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. So now we're talking about grandchildren. Multiply there and do not decrease. What's this all about? What's Jeremiah saying? Well, he's telling the people, you're going to be there a while. You're not leaving anytime soon. Now, I understand, this isn't their home, right? Their home is Jerusalem. They are in a place that is not their home. It's almost like they're journeyers, but they haven't reached their final destination yet. Kind of like us. This world is not our home. We're sojourners passing through, but this isn't our final destination. And yet Jeremiah says, settle down there. Make a life there. Be a part of the community there. Live. Don't spend all your time thinking about where you want to be or where you'd rather be. Be there. Then he goes on, verse 7, he says, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile. Now get this. The Babylonians are the ones that destroyed Jerusalem. So these Israelites, they had just seen the Babylonians destroy their home, tear down their temple, kill many of their friends and family, separate them from the rest of their friends and family. And now Jeremiah says, even though this place isn't your home, even though this isn't your final destination, even though the people here are kind of your enemy, even though they are opposed to what you think is right and good and just, even though all that is true, seek their good. Seek the good of the city. Seek the good of the people around you. Why? Well, he goes on to say, for in its welfare, you will find your welfare. Because if the city does well, you will do well. If the nation does well, you will do well. If your neighborhood does well, you will do well. Jeremiah says, look, I want you to engage the place where you are. So for them, that meant building houses and planting gardens. It meant having children and grandchildren. What does it mean for us to engage the place where we are? What does it mean for us to seek the welfare of our city or our state or our nation? I want to suggest to you that one of the things it means is that we vote and that we engage the political process. You see, we have this incredible privilege here in America in 2020. We have this incredible privilege that we can actually shape the leadership of our country. We can actually reward those who do well by voting for them. And we can punish those who do evil by not voting for them. We have this incredible privilege that has not existed for most of the history of mankind. And so if we are to follow the advice of Jeremiah here, if we are to seek the good of our city, we need to engage the political process. Now, this isn't just once every 4 years, right? This is bigger than that. We vote, but we also engage the process, and we look for opportunities to do good around us. We seek to love our neighbor. We seek to be salt. We seek to be light. But right now, in mid-October, weeks before an election, if we're going to be really practical about this, here's what it means. Use your vote to do as much good as possible for as many people as possible. This is a new way to think about voting. Don't vote for the person who just speaks the best. Your vote shouldn't necessarily be just for the person who will do what's good for you. Now that's radical, isn't it? A lot of times we think, well, I'm going to vote for the person who's going to do best for me. But the biblical principle is that I vote for who's going to do good for others. I vote not for the person who I've always voted for, but for the person who will do the most good for the most people possible. I don't vote just for the candidate who I'd like to have dinner with. I vote for the candidate who will do the most good possible for the most people possible. So let's get really practical with this. All right? Because the truth is, just about every political candidate, just about every ruler that we have, they want to do good for people, don't they? They just have different ideas about how that might work. And most of us would say, I want this to be true. I want to do as much good for as many people as possible. We just have different ideas about how to do that. So I might suggest to you this morning that one of the ways to think about this is long-term fix versus short-term fix. Sometimes it's really easy to see the short-term fix, the thing that looks really good right now, and say, hey, this is what we need to do. When in reality, fixing the short-term problem doesn't necessarily help as many people as possible. Imagine if you go to a car lot to get a new car, well, a used car, because you're wise and you don't want to spend all your money on a brand new car. So you go and you haggle with the guy and you say, I like this car, and all right, well, I just want to take it for a test drive. So you get in the car and you start it up and you drive it off the lot and you start going, you start to accelerate. And as you're accelerating, you're almost to that point where you know the car is going to shift from first gear into second gear, but instead it makes this horrendous noise and the car lurches and you hear a big thud and you hear the engine whining and everything seems wrong. You see smoke coming out of the engine, so you quickly turn around and you drive it back to the car dealership and you're like, look, this is terrible. I heard this sound and the dashboard, all the lights came on and it was terrible. And the car dealer says, well, let me take a look here. And so he goes in and he gets his little code reader. You know, they stick it under the dash and he sticks it and he plugs it in and he says, He hits a few buttons. He says, there you go. All the lights are gone. Check engine light's not on anymore. Everything is fixed. And you say, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Everything is not fixed. You didn't even look under the hood. He said, is the check engine light on? Well, no. Well, then it must be okay. You see, sometimes it's easy to solve the problem that's right in front of us, the first thing that we see, and forget about what the long-term consequences are. And so if I want to do as much good as possible for as many people as possible, I have to think short-term and long-term. So let me give you 4 ways to think about how you should vote. And maybe this isn't just about how you should vote, but how you should engage the political process. Number 1, look for candidates who talk more about solutions than about problems. Candidates who only talk about problems are only looking right in front of them. Candidates who are talking about solutions are thinking about the long term. Number 2, look for candidates who talk more about their own plans than about their opponent's faults. I hate the way we do commercials. You watch political commercials and all they tell you is, let me explain to you why my opponent is the spawn of Satan, right? And they will spend their entire 30 seconds telling you everything that's wrong about the other candidate, and most of the time, most of it's not even true. But that's very short-term thinking. Someone who is able to sit down and say, look, here's my plan for the future. This is my plan. I don't need to talk about my opponent. I'm talking about my plan. Someone who has a plan is looking for solutions. And solutions are how we do good for people. Number 3, look for candidates who talk more about hope than about fear. See, when I talk about fear, I'm trying to control you. I want you to be afraid so you'll give control over to me and do whatever I want you to do. But when I talk about hope, I'm inviting you to join me in the pursuit of something. Say, look, there is hope for the future. There is a bright future. You can join me in that. Look for the candidate that wants you to join you in doing as much good as possible for as many people as possible. Last one, number 4, look at their history. It is more predictive than their words. If a candidate has demonstrated that they want to do good for people, odds are they're going to continue doing good for people. And if they've demonstrated that they don't really do good for people, but they do a lot of good for themselves, odds are they'll continue to do that. Now, I know that some of you are tired of this. Some of you are weary of elections and politics, and you just want it to be done. You're kind of singing the song every day, some glad morning, when this life is over, I will fly away, and it will be wonderful. But until then, until you fly away, you're here. So while you are here, build houses, plant gardens, have families, seek the good of your city or your state or your nation. We as God's people are tasked with using the resources He has given to us to brighten the world around us. And as Christians in America in 2020, we've been given an incredible privilege to engage our political process and to use the political process to do as much good as possible for as many people as possible. So how should we vote? Well, we should vote wisely, but cautiously. We should vote courageously after much consideration. But ultimately, we should use our vote to do as much good as possible for as many people as possible. Because that is what Jesus has called us to do. Let's pray. Father, you've been so good to us in so many ways. Sometimes we can't even understand and grasp what it means to live as Americans in 2020 with all the blessings and privileges you've given us. But right now, it's easy for us to see the division and the tension and the stress and the strife and the fighting and the anger, to be distracted by all of that. Father, open our eyes to the good. Open our eyes to the possibilities, to the potential, to the opportunities you have given us to do good in your world. Help us to be people who are shining a light into the darkness. Help us to be people who are representing you to your creation. Father, more than anything else, thank you for Jesus, who made all of this possible. Thank you that he was willing to give his life to do the best thing possible for us and to do the one thing for us that we could never do for ourselves. Thank you for that. Be with us this week. Help us to represent you well. In your name.